All right, hello everyone. We're just past 11, so I would like to get started. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting on today, the Wurundjeri people, and I would also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. Welcome to my talk. I'm Jennifer Reuter, and today we're going to be talking about colours on time. Stronger schemes, fewer headaches. That is the plan, at least. I have worked for a variety of different productions across indie studios, across different colour schemes as well, including moody, dark, mysterious colour schemes, which is my personal favourite, but also like very poppy, bubblegum, vibrant colour schemes. But my real background comes in comic art. And just like game development, comics can take forever to make, especially once you start adding colour into the picture. You know, your classic webcomic with a full colour scheme takes 10 years to make, and I didn't want to spend that much time on it, and I still wanted to have some color to work with, so I tried everything. I tried learning how to make color schemes and tints, and tried to learn the gamut method from James Gurney, and then I tried to make a gamut maker that would turn a color scheme into a wishy-washy thing. But then when I tried to apply it to actual comics, it actually made the colors more flat and really hard and tedious to keep a control of everything that's going on. When I started to apply them using local colors into an actual comic page, the local colors looked fine because I had the time to spend to design every single color on the page. But then when it came to actually putting it in the panels with scenery, with lighting, and trying to equalize everything, the local colors would stick out, they would not fit in. It just became kind of a wash of gray, and I wasn't happy and I was very frustrated. So I thought there must be an easier way to do this. And there is, but before we can get into the fun part of how to do it, we first need to go into a little bit of theory. You guessed it, we're going to talk about relative color theory. It is the pain for pretty much all artists. As soon as you learn about relative color theory, you start getting headaches. The reason is because the point of colors is that the colors don't stay the same. A red apple is not going to be a red apple when it's inside a green room with yellow lighting. It changes. It looks kind of brown. Sometimes it looks gray. Sometimes it looks just, I don't know, something. And this can be hard to learn, especially if you're trying to achieve realism in your lighting setup. But what if I told you that actually relative color theory, or the perception of color, can work to your advantage? That our eyes fill the gaps for us majority of the time, or in other words, our eyes are kind of stupid. To prove the point, expressionists and impressionists in the early 20th century and contemporary artists who continue to be inspired by that work, myself included, rejected the traditional idea of perceptual colors, that they need to be accurate in order to make sense. They went, no, let's toss that out the window, let's just slap some colors on the canvas and see what happens. And I enjoy this particular style because it's so evocative, it's so emotionally driven, and it has a lot of room for experimentation. What I learned from these artists is that values set the scene, they make things make sense, but colors set the feeling. So the technique that I developed over time, and this will look so deceptively simple, is a type of color palette. The way that I structure this very specifically is that the colors are grouped by values, and I tend to group them by color family, so reds, oranges, greens. This way I get an overview of the colors that I am using in a certain family, because you don't want to use all the greens, you don't want to use all the blues, you kind of want to be specific. But more importantly, the gray values is what we're going to be working with the most, because I map the colors to the values first rather than thinking about local color. And I'll show you what that all looks like. The other great thing about having a color palette like this is that it does both give me a lot of variety without me getting stuck in to decision paralysis like with the gamut stuff that I was doing before. So can you, and like this might look limiting, but you can create some very different results from a particular color scheme. Now, can you actually create a complete color scheme with limited color values? For example, here's some personal work that I've done. You'd look at it and go, okay, we're not using all the colors of the rainbow, but it looks like we're using a lot of colors still, like a complete color palette. Nope. We're using only those, except for the red. I haven't included that in the color scheme. But besides using some multiply, hard light, screen, various layer effects that still use the base colors, I'm not using that much. Our eyes are filling the blanks for us. And here's an example from Paper Cactus Games, the work that I've done for them quite recently, a lot of illustrations. This is a case study of, do we need to use the local values of the character design in order to create the final piece? No. The coat is never a medium blue-gray. And for goodness sake, the top right example, the white of the head, it's orange. What the heck? What? Huh? Come on, what's going on? So after I learned this technique that I will show you, everything just opened up for me. Suddenly I wasn't struggling with making colors work for me. They were doing the hard work for me. And I even took it so far to believe that, what if colors don't matter at all? What if I just work on the values and... Okay, all right. This works, you know, it's clear, but we are losing a little bit of the storytelling, the feeling that we want to evoke through colors. But I guess my point is, don't be afraid to do something kind of ridiculous, because it will still kind of work. By the way, this exercise is from Marco Bucci. I highly recommend doing this exercise, which is basically blind color application to a piece. So in order to... point being, the amount that you can get away with the chaos of the colors depends on the style that you're going to be focusing on. You'd think that realism is hard and minimalism is easy. No, they're both incredibly difficult, but for very different reasons. Realism is hard because we live in real life, and so we can spot the issues pretty easily. There are so many rules around lighting, materials, and rendering that you have to get right, and so the pressure is high for you and your team to be on the ball with those techniques and skills. Minimalism is hard because you can risk confusion and legibility issues. Everything needs to be placed precisely, every single shot, every single movement, every single animation, because if you don't do it right, so to speak, you lose your audience. The sweet spot is somewhere in the middle. It gives you the flexibility of, you know, getting away with things while still limiting your choices enough that you're not spending forever working on it. So the rest of this talk, I'm going to be focusing on process and troubleshooting, mostly using the work that I've done for Paper Cactus Games, but a few other different projects across both 2D flat style and painted. If any of you here are 3D artists, I'm sorry, I am only a 2D artist. I can't give you specific techniques, but I hope that some of the theory can be transferable to your shaders, your lighters, and your textures. And I will be referring to compositions and illustrations. Obviously, your game has a lot more going on than that. It's just easier for me to work with. So I have a bit of a chicken and egg problem. Do I show you how to make the color palette first, or do I show you how to make the art first? Because you need the palette to make the art and art to make the palette. And so the process tends to be a lot of back and forth, back and forth. But what I'll do is I'll start with the color palette so you can get an idea what to expect as you're creating art. So when creating this kind of color palette, when you do have art to work with, what you will be doing is grouping your colors together. Choose the most occurring colors and then group them by their color, by their value. You might think, oh goodness, we're going to end up with 500 colors. You might be surprised how often they tend to group together as more than you think. You're not going to have as many core colors as you might think. And this will change with time. You'll probably start applying your color palette and realize, we're not using this color at all, so let's get rid of it. Or, we're missing a bunch of colors actually, so let's put them in. Now, if you don't have existing art in the project, you're going to have to probably make some of them. I tend to start with creating mini illustrations and marketing style work that sort of emulates the final look. Keep them small, keep them simple. Don't try to create final huge pieces if you can avoid it, or create background concept design, because your assets, your character designs, your objects are going to live in a setting, and your background is going to dictate what the lighting is, what the main flat colors are going to be, everything. So backgrounds are also a great place to start. But you also don't have to create this artwork from a vacuum. Absolutely make mood boards. If you really wanted, you could also start building your color palette from a mood board. Just be conscious of the fact that the artwork as reference material needs to be kind of similar-ish to each other, otherwise you might end up with much too broad of a color palette. Now, one thing I don't recommend doing is going to pre-made palettes online. The reason is that they can be a good triage tool if you're stuck. Like, how do I make this, what I have, look a little bit neater and a little bit more concise? But as a starting point, they're kind of limiting, and they're made to look pretty and like out of the box. But it doesn't give you room to experiment, to really invent what the theme of your work is going to look like. If you do want to limit your, make a sort of color scheme limitation, analogous colors, complementary colors, triads. Use more of a gamut style so that you still have a lot of neutrals to work with. In order for our color palette to really do its work well, though, we need to keep values in mind. And just like with the overall color rendering style, you have a difficulty degree. Low contrast is very difficult, and very high contrast is also quite challenging, for very similar reasons as realism and minimalism. Low contrast requires an excellent understanding of lighting and like the slightest differentiation between colors. Like in that second piece by the Mintu, you can see that beautiful like maroon with teal in the shadow of the face, but really hard to balance as a value set. Likewise, high contrast like minimalism, you can risk getting things confusing because too much high contrast is hard to read. So I'm not going to be able to go into good value design into a lot of detail, otherwise we won't have time for colors. But I'll go through the main process and a few tips. I start with silhouettes, which is a pure black and white representation of the composition. The darks and the lights can represent a dark color, but they can also represent lighting. They kind of get mixed together in this process. Some tips I have is use the 70-30 rule or 80-20. Basically just don't do 50-50, otherwise the focus is there's not much of a focus to the piece and it just becomes kind of, plain. And you want clear but not obvious silhouettes. For example, you have a bunch of visible figures here, but I've tried to sort of merge them together with other figures or background elements. I've tried to sort of break them up a little bit, like in the middle one, the helmet of the main character is white, so that it's not just, this is a person silhouette, but then behind him is like a vertical graphic design bar that's still helping his head to sort of appear in the composition and not just disappear. So you kind of have to chop and change at it until something is mysterious enough to look at, but not so mysterious you can't make sense of it. The other thing that I suggest is avoid the checkerboard problem. I suffer from this horribly. This is a comic example page, but basically it's when you have too much of the dark and the light taking turns next to each other. Dark light, dark light, dark light. You can't focus. You don't know what the heck is going on. So don't do it. There's just no focus. And this design process applies even to pastel or low contrast pieces. The black doesn't mean we're literally using black in the piece or white in the piece. It just means that we're trying to represent an overall summary of the darkest areas versus the lightest areas. Then at some point, the black and white values don't give me enough information to start working with colors, so I will add a mid-tone. In this example, I'm already using the value scheme in the color palette to start mapping things out. I still stick to dark versus light, but I start to vary it up. If you don't yet have a color palette and sort of a value palette, just use one mid-tone to sort of help differentiate things, just 1 degree further, create a little degree of interest. And one way to do that is by assigning values to different grounds. This is something that I learned from an artist called Kirby Fangen, and basically she went over how make a decision if you want your background to be dark values, your foreground to be light values, or your background to be mid-tones, your foreground to be dark values. If you have middle ground, background, foreground, mix it up. Far background is dark, middle is, you keep going. What is great about doing this particular exercise is you can already start to see how the lighting is going to work for that scene. Is it overcast? Is it a sunny day? Is it nighttime? Somehow these value sort of groupings start to reveal that information to you. Now it's to the fun part. We've done our value design. We've worked hard to make sure that they are clear and interesting enough. Now we start to actually apply that to color thumbing. What I start off with is maybe 1 or 2 versions, in this case the first 2 columns, where I manually color it in without using any effects or anything. But I'm not thinking about local colors at this point. All I'm doing is I'm basically going, my value says this is a mid-gray. What is available in my color palette in mid-gray? I'm going to pick a color and I'm going to plonk it there. It sounds ridiculous, but yes, that's how I do it. I might have in the back of my mind, oh yeah, the character has a green shirt, but I'm not going to think about exactly which green. I'm just going to pick a green, maybe even a yellow, and see what happens. And the first 2 passes will be sort of common sense, but as I go along, after those first 2 manual drawings with background, middle ground, foreground, just to keep it sort of segmented, then I start going into a process that I really enjoy doing, which is using things like color balance modifiers, levels, hue and saturation effects, layer effects in the program of choice, because what these various tools do across any kind of drawing program is they create these lovely little accidentals. Colors that you weren't expecting to have in your color design, they pop up at the edges and they mix things together really interestingly. It kind of recreates like how traditional color mediums, when you mix 2 colors, like yellow and blue creates green, you're kind of recreating that effect. Digital work can suffer from the grayness when things mix together, and that's when you end up with muddy colors by accident. And I will often then include those accidentals into the final design. Now you've done all your color design, you've worked out which ones are your strongest ones, and you still kind of need to make sure to equalize them. with each other and with the other work in the existing designs. If you find that your experimentation went way outside of your color scheme, you can pull it back again. You can recreate the exact same sort of vibe, but with the colors that you have set up for yourself. So you're never really losing control at any point in time. Now comes the scary bit. But to be honest, I find this to be the easiest part, where we transfer the colors that we've planned into the final artwork. The reason I say it's the easiest part is because we've done the heavy lifting already. We just need to transfer it now. We don't have to think about the how it's going to be lit, how it's going to be colored. But there are still a few things you might want to be aware of. If this is a painted style final piece, you can pretty much do color picking from the thumbnail. Just split it up into however many layers of foreground, middle ground, background, and just work through it piece by piece. But if you're doing a flat style, there's a little bit more work that needs to go into it. So for example, you need to make a decision from the thumbnail, what is going to be the base color? Are you going to be working with the darks or the lights? And then, are you adding lighting to the dark or adding shadows to the light? The effect can be slightly different or very different depending on the composition, and I choose based on what seems easiest, what makes sense for that particular piece. One thing you do want to avoid doing, and this is a little bit of lighting theory, is having a layer that represents the shadow and a layer that represents the light and then the local color in between. First of all, it's not really correct, and it also doesn't make the most of your color scheme. You're just sort of relying on your local colors. And this is the problem that I was running into as a comic artist. Because if you know your lighting theory, you have areas that face the light, you have areas that face the shadow. There's a little bit of in-between, but largely they can be distinct so long as not everything is rendered smoothly or everything isn't a smooth surface. I tend to only have one layer to represent either the shadow or the light. I don't use both. If I wanted to have other anatomy pieces of lighting, like for example edge lighting, sure, they can go on a different layer, like specular, rim light, and ambient occlusion. So let's see what it looks like in practice. This is going to be a time lapse. It's going to be a time, no. It decided to be a time lapse. No? Come on. There we go. So as you're seeing, I have the thumbnail in the corner, and I'm just first of all applying everything more or less flat. In the thumbnail, we have the main character sort of a dark blue, and I didn't provide all the colors in the thumbnail because I'm allowing myself space to experiment on the actual page. Obviously, I didn't just make the reddish parts, which are in the original design, yellow. I didn't just make it yellow. I went, what is the equivalent dark value? Like again, I went through my dark values and I went, which one would fit into this context? And just picked it and went with it. And from the thumbnail, I'm also making decisions. Do I want certain colors to be the line art? Is it going to be a highlight? Is it going to be, there we go, are there going to be effects to make it more interesting? But somewhere in the middle here, and we're going to see this in a moment, I realized that this piece turned out kind of gray and not particularly enticing. So here we go. Here's where things start to go a little bit off the script. Oh boy. Because sometimes what definitely happens is you'll come to the end of a piece and you'll realize that the color scheme didn't actually work out. So, how do you troubleshoot this? Well, the first place to check if you're having issues with the color scheme is you check the gray values. You just check the values. Usually, a lot of the time, what happens is that it tends to just get kind of gray scale and just kind of in the middle. And there's not enough contrast. There's not enough variation to the story that it's or the composition. So that's the first place to check at all times. Remember, values are doing most of the work for you. But if, for example, like with 1A and 1B, values look fine, then it's more a case of tweaking it to match the hues of other pieces. So I noticed, that's looking a bit too cyan. It would look better if it was more towards the turquoise, like 3 and 4. So not only did I try to work out with 2B how to bring it closer to the other color schemes, and this is using color balance modifier or any sort of manual drawing. Then my team, Leo and Zen, who are the art director and another artist on the team, we workshopped it together. And in this case, Leo suggested, hey, put in a bit of a spotlight. So this is the solution, everybody. Put in a spotlight. It fixes everything. But after we discussed that, I combined the two. And again, this is done on a thumbnail scale. I make the changes as many as I can small, and then when I transfer it to the big scale, I go through all of the layers that I've already set up and kind of fix things little bit by little bit. It's a bit of a tedious process, but it is much faster than sitting there going, I don't know what's wrong. What's going on? Why does it look weird? And sometimes you have to fix multiple pieces because there are multiple issues. And some of the fixes are easy and some of them are like, oh, gee, okay, let's try a completely different go at this. And sometimes you get the right feeling, but it's just not poppy enough. So there we go. Now, I'm just going to step through this one a little bit quicker. This is a painting example. It doesn't have a color palette, so I had a lot more sort of freedom to interpret it as I wanted it. But it's the same principles apply. So, as you can see, did the value testing and the ground testing to really knuckle down the values for this one. And I think paintings require a lot more work on this. Then explored the various different options. Don't be scared to make it pink and burgundy and just mess around with it. Sometimes I will find that colors, even in the strange designs, like number 8 has a lot of pastel pinks, which don't fit into the sort of murky vibe we were going for. But I would then go, actually, I do want a little bit of that pink in the final piece. It just helps to broaden the horizons, if you will. And once you pick there's the value tests. And once you pick your best ones, again, I check the values. One thing you really should practice, which I recommend, is being able to internalize what is the local value of a color. For example, red. People tend to think red is a bright and light color. That's because it's so saturated. But it's actually most of the time a mid-tone, which means if you're intending this character must be red in the composition, it means that everything else either needs to be much darker or much lighter. So as you can see, 1A and 1B is the value version of 1A. The figure kind of just gets lost. You can't see them. But in 1C, I went, okay, let's make the background much lighter. And 2A and 2B was just a test to see, what if everything was a lot lighter? But again, we're losing the red even in that one. And color tests don't just have to be compositionally. You can do it for trying to see how do you want to apply the colors to actually rendering something, because that kind of detail is also important. And this is the final piece. I would have liked to have shown you the process, but I didn't have a time lapse for this one. So the whole point of this talk was, this is supposed to make things easier, not harder. So let's see if it actually did the job. I'll give just a few disclaimers. I don't really have a comparison for how long it used to take me to make art like this, because it's taken me years to get to this point with using the techniques that I use today. And the other thing I've been told is that I work fast, so please take this with a grain of salt. So, not including the sketch designs, which probably adds another hour or two to the process. But this is what it looks like when I use the techniques that I have shown you. And obviously I've been using them a lot, so I've gotten used to it and practiced with it. And this is what it looks like for a 2D flat style. So, amazingly, something as simple as that color palette tool and mapping colors to values rather than trying to recalculate colors all the time. It means that colors are more flexible and more forgiving than you think. The values do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. And when you know how to use these kinds of techniques, you'll free yourself up to create punchier and more unexpected color combinations that enrich the story and the style of your project without having to break your back over getting it working. Thank you very much. Now, if you would like to continue following my personal work, red pill, I suppose. Just be aware that my personal work is horror inclined, it's spooky, it's gory, it can be intense at times, so if that's your cup of tea, you're welcome to follow me there. My newsletter is also about my personal stories that I write in those styles and genres. But if you're more interested in useful things that I talk about from time to time, I hope they're useful things and not just nonsense, and my professional work, you're welcome to follow me on LinkedIn. I will actually be active on there going forward, and my email, of course, for any other questions. I believe now we have quite a good amount of time for questions. We were going to try out the Q&A app, but it's not really working the way that I was hoping it would. So we're going to do it the old school way with a microphone. Please wait for my good friend Jane to help us out with the microphone. But anyone has a question, please put your hand up.
Hi, thank you for the talk.
Thank you.
I was wondering how you balance emotion and narrative with appeal and clarity in an illustration. For example, a piece that might be quite emotively bleak or dark, but you still want it to be legible or appealing to the audience. I was wondering how you approach pieces like that.
I mean, personally, I'm more emotively leaning in terms of the pieces that I create. Of course, when I work professionally, my job is to create clear storytelling. So I will knuckle down on the values really, really hard. I mentioned before that low contrast, for example, is quite difficult to pull off. I want to get so good at low contrast. I love it when an artist goes, we have this red mixed with this ultramarine blue. And if you look at the values, they're the exact same value. And it's not a good idea for, clarity. But in certain places, you can get away with it. Of course, we also want to consider color blindness. So if there is critical information that you need to transfer, you don't want to make it just pretty and then make it not make sense. But it really depends on the end product. So if you're creating something that's meant to be interpreted, you can kind of be more playful and not have to focus on the values working out. But if something really needs to make sense, then it's pretty much on a scale, isn't it? It's like, you want more clarity, more value work. If you don't really care, more colors. So that's what I would say.
With this particular technique, have you tried or seen your team members
I can hear you.
into things like asset creation, UI, or any other parts like reference sheets, any other parts of the games development process?
Thank you. Because I've only just started using this particular technique in independent projects, there is a little bit of training involved because the way that I work obviously isn't necessarily industry standard. It derives off a lot of theory, obviously. But I've been very lucky that the teams that I've worked with have also had some really good artists on the team, so they would sort of pick up on what I present, especially if I'm just walking through the process, the values, then the color, forms, and that. Even just doing that gives everyone else a context of how am I even getting to the end result? And like, for example, with Paper Cactus Games, awesome people, they started using some of my techniques, like, okay, not just the sketch and then the colors, like sketch values colors. As far as UI, more flat style graphic design is concerned, translation is a little tricky because, like I said, illustrations or like any sort of creative storytelling art has a lot of leeway and flexibility. Like the colors don't have to be exact. But graphic design in the minimalism quadrant needs to be very specific. So you can't use all the colors in the color palette you might create for illustrations. You might have to be like, okay, we have to narrow these 20 colors down to 5. And that's a whole extra process. I wished I could talk to you about minimalism specifically, but to be honest, that is not my forte. So, yeah. But I think it can be applicable. It just needs a bit more, another step of skill and process.
Do you have any people that you would recommend checking out to learn some more of the theory on value, on colors, on anything super good, I suppose?
So the question was, any recommendations of people or resources to learn color from? I think one of my favorite online teachers, which I mentioned earlier in this talk, was Marco Bucci. Obviously, I'm a little bit biased because his work leans towards expressionistic techniques, but he provides some amazing fundamentals. Like, I think majority of the skills that I've shown you today are heavily inspired by those videos. Absolutely, like, exercises are fun. Like, it's hard to make art exercises fun. He makes them fun. So if for no other reason, check them out for that. Yeah. Yes. I keep forgetting the microphone isn't being used.
I was just curious about like how you go about with the color blindness, making your work more accessible. You kind of went a little bit into it, but and obviously there's different like types of color blindness, but like how do you go about making it accessible?
So the question was about how do we make sure to address color blindness and make even if we do color experimentation, how do we make it accessible? It was interesting because during the Paper Cactus work, one of the things that the team wanted to make sure of was that every piece was friendly to various types of color blindness. There is a website, I can't remember it off by heart, but there is a website that will take your piece and then convert it to various types of color blindness. Test, test, test. Just keep doing that to make sure that clarity is always there. However, high contrast or like well-balanced contrast in the values, that's all you need to actually really focus on, because regardless of the type of color blindness, values will always provide clarity. Always. Like, you saw how vibrant those pieces were. When I took them through the color blindness test, no problem. No issue, because I put so much time and effort into making sure that the lights and the darks and the story is legible from that perspective. The lower contrast you go, the more careful you need to be. That's where things can start to like get difficult for somebody who may be colorblind. But yeah, values again. Values are king in that situation. Yeah, and shapes. So from a graphic design perspective, don't just rely on colors, use shapes. This is a slight tangent. Use circles, use squares, use triangles. Shape language, multiple symbolism, please. Don't expect somebody to differentiate orange from yellow if that's the only differentiation you have with like critical information. Yeah. Yes?
You said that your process and techniques aren't typically industry standard. I was wondering in what ways do they differ significantly from what's normally done in the industry when creating works like this?
So the question was, how does my technique differ to industry standard techniques? I'd like to give a better answer, but I haven't had much of a chance to work in bigger studios. I did work for an animation studio, and what they did is that they spent a lot of time doing color scripting, which is kind of what we're doing, but you'd have team members who are very skilled in color theory and design. They would provide the rest of the team with very extensive guides. They would create the test art, and then they would basically build step-by-step instructions. These are the shadows being used. These are the main core colors being used. This is how we're treating the line art. So it was very much reliant on more experienced people in the team providing the material for the rest of us to build upon. And this was background art specifically. Sadly, I don't have much more beyond that. I just imagine I know that values, working from values then to color, that is pretty standard. I just don't think it's very frequent that somebody will go, let's just, forget all the color rules of like triads and complementary colors and just kind of, I think that's the only part where it might not be standard, but yeah.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Yes, please.
On ongoing production, do you set yourself a strict tonal palette from the start and stick with that, or are you swapping out colours between pieces?
So do I stick to a strict color palette across a project or swap between color palettes? It really depends on the production. Like I mentioned with that, what I just described in the previous question, the animation production was had a color script, and there were very different color schemes across the script. I don't think that it really depends on your project, honestly. You can have a very strict color palette if you want. It just means the restrictions might start biting you in the butt later on. But at the same time, if you have too much variation, it can all kind of go out of hand. Most of the work that I've done, I like to try to stick to my limits as much as I can. But sometimes you kind of have to break outside of it. But the beauty of working like this is that you don't feel lost in making that decision. It's a very conscious, we actually need a separate color scheme because we're an act free, and we actually want act free to feel different to the rest of the game or the rest of the story. Yeah. So I believe we have a few more minutes left. Do we have maybe 1 or 2 questions that we might want to cover? Yes, please.
Hello. I'm a 3D artist, so I want to be really good for. I want to be applying some more color stuff to the environmental art that goes into a piece, because we want really nice visuals and environmental art. How would you go about balancing a character's color scheme with moving through different environments in the game?
So, like I mentioned before, I'm not a 3D artist, so I can't give you tooling or specifics. All I understand is that, it's hard to give an example. I imagine, though, you want your game engine or your rendering engine or your lighting engine to have as much manipulative power of the original colors of the model as possible, I imagine. Because if, for example, let's say your character's like a lot of purple colors, but they end up in a green scene, and you're just sort of automatically applying the lighting, and it just looks kind of brown and sad, you might need to actually almost alter the base colors using a shader or something, so that it looks maybe in a green scene it doesn't look like brown, but maybe it looks like a magenta-ish, or like that family group magenta colors, because that will have a bit more pop to it. I can't give any good examples. You're probably going to have to do a lot of testing, taking screenshots, and then working outside of the game and see if you can create the environment you actually want it to look like. Yeah. Maybe one more? Yeah, sure.
Just had a question about your art specifically. What art software do you have experience with?
So the question is, what art software do I have experience with? My favorite software is Reuter. It's a free software and it's a powerhouse. It has replaced Photoshop for me. I love using it. Only caveat is you can't translate. If you really love your Photoshop brushes, you can't just port them over. That's the sad part. But I've built up my own library of brushes that I use that are just as good. Clip Studio Paint I also use from time to time. It's also very good, but for different reasons. I recommend trying out Rebel. It's cool because it has a lot of funky little painting features. Like when you mix colors together, they work like paint. If you want to mess around with quasi-traditional in a digital space, that one's fun. But as my main workhorse, Reuter is my choice. Yeah. And I believe we're at the end of it. So thank you very much for coming and enjoy the rest of GCAP.